When the rescue boat finally breached the reef after 15 years, the French sailors expected to find bodies. What they found instead stopped them cold. 7 women, 1 infant, a fire that had never gone out. How do 8 people, 7 of them women, 1 of them a baby born on a sandbank, survive 15 years on a piece of coral so small you can walk the entire length of it in 4 minutes? Who made the decision to keep that fire burning on the 1001st night when no ship had come? And why, when the French sailors finally waded ashore, did they immediately fall silent? Not from grief, but from something much harder to name. What those men saw on that beach would follow them for the rest of their lives. The captives were not passengers, they were cargo. They had been loaded onto the lower deck of l'Utile, the Useful, a French East India Company frigate, somewhere off the northwest coast of Madagascar in the summer of 1761. Approximately 160 of them, men, women, and children. The purchase had been illegal under French maritime law at the time, which is exactly why the hatches above their heads had been nailed shut from the outside. Not locked, nailed. Because locked hatches could be explained. Nailed hatches were designed to be invisible on inspection. Above them, the French crew knew the route well. The Indian Ocean crossing to Ile-de-France, what we now call Mauritius, was a profitable run for the company, and First Officer Barthélemy Castellan de Vernet had made it before. The ship's captain, a man named Lafargue, was present but increasingly erratic, or prone to episodes that the crew whispered about in the lower quarters. In practical terms, Castellan was already running the ship. On the night of July 31st, 1761, l'Utile was moving fast on a favourable wind. The officers would have been navigating by the stars and a set of charts that were, as it turned out, wrong by several miles. One detail from that journey would survive everything that was about to happen. It wasn't the logbook. It wasn't the cargo manifest. It was the ship's hull itself, thick copper plating that had been riveted along the waterline to protect the wood from shipworm. It was the most expensive material on the vessel, and on the night of the wreck it made a sound that no one aboard would ever forget, a grinding, metallic shriek as the reef tore through it from below. That sound was the first warning. Now, it came exactly 4 seconds before the hull broke open. The reef hit l'Utile from below at approximately 2300 hours. The ship didn't stop. That's the part that never gets captured properly in accounts of wrecks. Ships that strike coral at speed don't stop. They grind. The bow went down first, and the momentum of 600 tons of loaded frigate drove it forward across the reef shelf, for what witnesses later estimated was nearly a full minute. The sound was not a crack. It was continuous. A tearing mechanical scream of copper and oak dragged across ancient coral at 6 knots, and the vibration travelled through every plank and beam in the ship. Below decks, in total darkness, the captives had no visual information at all. They had sound, they had violent motion, they had each other. The water came in fast, not as a flood, but as a surge that hit the walls and floor at the same time, cold even in the Indian Ocean summer, and the temperature in July at that latitude would have been around 26 degrees Celsius on the surface, but significantly colder in the low darkness of the hold where the seawater had been sitting in the keel. Above, Castellan ordered the lifeboats. The French crew began moving. Some of them had already launched before anyone thought to look at the hatches. And then, here is the moment that defines everything that follows. At least one officer stood in front of those nailed-down hatches, heard the sounds from below, and made a decision. The logbook does not record who gave the order to leave them. It records only what happened next. The hatches stayed shut. The hull groaned for another 40 minutes as the sea worked it apart. The reef did, as eventually what the French officers did not. A section of the lower hull split clean along a seam, the same copper-reinforced seam that had screamed across the coral, and the breach allowed roughly half the captives to force their way out into the black water. They swam toward the light of fires already burning on a sandbank 200 meters away, where the French crew had gathered. When morning came, 122 Frenchmen and approximately 80 Malagasy survivors stood together on Ile de Sable, a name that means simply island of sand. It measured less than 1 square kilometre. There was not a single tree, and there was no fresh water anywhere on it. The thirst came before the grief. Within the first 24 hours on the island, people began to show the early signs of dehydration, the sandpaper texture spreading across the tongue, the eyeballs beginning to ache in their sockets, the way heat transforms from a condition into a physical pressure when you have no water to sweat. The Indian Ocean, summer on Tromelin, runs between 28 degrees Celsius and 35 degrees Celsius in full sun. There is no shade on the island, there is nowhere to go. Castellan ordered the Malagasy to dig. They dug with their hands and with pieces of the wreckage, going down through the sand and then through the compressed coral beneath it, 15 feet down in some sections, and what they found was not water, not exactly. It was a thick, milky white liquid that smelled faintly of minerals and had a metallic taste on the back of the throat that made people gag before they drank it. Brackish, technically, barely potable, but it did not kill them. They drank and they lived. And that distinction between barely surviving and not surviving at all is the only distinction that matters on Tromelin. Castellan began salvaging the wreck. The plan was immediately clear to everyone, though he announced it as a shared project. They would build a boat from the wreckage of Lutil and sail to Mauritius. It was a reasonable plan. It was the only plan. And for 2 months, the French crew and the Malagasy captives worked side by side, not as equals, but as people with a temporarily aligned interest in not dying on this sandbank. 3 weeks in, a sail appeared on the horizon. Someone saw it from the high ground near the well. The only high ground, a coral ridge barely 2 meters above sea level. And the word travelled across the island in seconds. People ran. The signal fire they had built was lit, stoked, fed with everything burnable, and it sent a column of black smoke 40 feet into the air. The sail moved on. It never changed course. The sound that followed, not screaming, not weeping, but a particular silence that spreads through a group of people who have simultaneously understood something, was, by several later accounts, the worst moment of the entire first month. The French continued building their boat. They named it La Providence. La Providence was 33 feet long. When they were done, Castellan did the calculation he had almost certainly done before the keel was laid. The boat held 122 men. There were 122 French crew members. That number was, in retrospect, not a coincidence. It was a design specification. On September 27, 1761, 58 days after the wreck, the French crew carried the Malagasy captives' share of the remaining food stores to the beach. Castellan left them with enough dried fish and grain for perhaps 3 weeks. He told them, with what witnesses later described as apparent sincerity, that he would send a rescue ship. He said it directly. He looked at people when he said it. La Providence sailed north on the morning tide. Within an hour, it had cleared the reef. Within 2 hours, it was gone. The 80 people left on the beach stood there for a long time. There are no written accounts of what was said, because there was no one there to write it down. What we know is what they did next. They rebuilt the signal fire. They made it larger. They kept it burning through the night. Nobody came. Months became years. The food Castellan left lasted 19 days. They had estimated 3 weeks, but hunger makes miscalculations feel personal, and by the end of the 3rd week on the island alone, the group was already hunting the terns and brown boobies that nested in the coral. The birds were not afraid of humans. They'd never had reason to be, which made them easy to catch and made eating them feel, for reasons the survivors would not have been able to articulate, worse than it should have. The first typhoon came in the southern hemisphere summer of 1762. There are no trees to bend on Tromelin, so there is no visible warning. The wind simply begins, and then it escalates past the point where standing upright is possible, and the island, 11 feet above sea level, at its highest point, disappears under surge water that comes from all sides simultaneously. As they had built shelters from the coral by then, thick walled blockhouses with no windows, and they pressed themselves into the corners and listened to the island trying to erase them. By the end of the 2nd year, people had begun to die in earnest. Starvation leaves specific evidence in the human mind before it leaves evidence in the body. The intrusive thoughts arrive first. Food memories that surface with hallucinatory precision, the smell of specific dishes, the exact texture of things eaten years ago. Several of the survivors would later describe, to Tromelin's crew, in fragments that got written down, hearing voices they recognized. A mother hearing a child's name spoken in the wind when no one was there. A woman who spent 3 days certain she could smell cooked rice, could locate it, was following it. Though somewhere in the 4th or 5th year, the exact timing is lost, a woman sat at the edge of the island in the dark and counted the people she still recognized in the group. She was doing arithmetic the way people do when they don't want to confront what the numbers mean. She stopped counting at a number that told her more than half of the 80 were gone. She went back to the fire. She fed it a piece of driftwood she had been saving, a large piece, one she'd dragged up from the reef shelf at low tide. She didn't have a plan. She was not strategic. She was just not ready to let the fire go out. And in that particular moment, not ready was the same as alive. Then, in 1773, 12 years in, a ship appeared. Not a sail on the horizon. A ship close enough to see people on the deck. The 1773 ship couldn't breach the reef. Out the French vessel made 3 attempts, then 4, then, with the reef opening the hull below the waterline with each pass. The captain called it. But one sailor, a man whose name the records don't preserve, refused to leave. He stripped off his coat, went over the side, and swam for the island through the surf. He made it. The ship, unable to hold position in the surge, was forced to abandon him. He was one more mouth. He was also the first new information the survivors had received in 12 years. He told them what he knew, that Castellan had made it to Mauritius, that he had filed his report, that the report mentioned the abandoned captives, that no rescue ship had been dispatched. What happened in the women's faces when they heard this? Whether it was rage or a kind of terrible, clarifying relief at having the truth confirmed was not recorded. The sailor, after some months, built a raft. He took 3 men and 3 women from the group. They launched into the Indian Ocean and were never seen again. The remaining women turned back to the island, and they built. They had been working with the wreck's debris for years, but now, with the arithmetic of survival down to its final numbers, they systematized. The copper hull plating from Lutil had been scattered across the reef shelf since the night of the wreck. It was heavy. Moving it required 2 people working together, timing the waves, dragging it up the coral shelf by hand. But copper, unlike wood, doesn't rot. It doesn't burn. And copper, given enough time, enough heat from a fire that had been burning for a decade and a half, and enough force from a piece of coral used as a hammer, can be shaped. The women had been watching fire and metal interact for 15 years. They knew things about heat and malleability that no one had taught them. They hammered the copper into bowls, into tools, into objects that could hold water, catch rain, process food. The archaeological dig that researchers conducted on Tromelin in 2006 found these objects preserved in the sand, delicate, precise, beautiful. And the archaeologists who catalogued them were not prepared for how refined they were. These were not the tools of people who were barely surviving. They were the tools of people who had decided to live. The corvette Dauphine broke through the reef on November 29th, 1776, 5,479 days after the wreck. Ensign Tromelin brought her in on a rare window of calm, reading the reef like a text he'd been studying, and when his sailors waded ashore, what they found required a moment before any of them could speak. 7 women. 1 infant, 8 months old, born on the island to one of the survivors. A child who had never seen a tree, never felt rain on a roof, never heard any language spoken by anyone, who had not stood on this exact piece of coral. The sailors had expected wreckage. They found order. The fire was burning on its platform, tended and stoked, exactly as it had been for 15 years. The blockhouses were swept clean. The copper bowls, shaped by hand, hammered from a dead ship's hull, were arranged precisely. The 7 women were wearing garments made entirely of bird feathers, and those garments were not ragged. They were maintained. The detail that Ensign Tromelin's officers kept returning to in their reports was not the fire, and not the feather clothing, and not the infant. It was the organization. The fire, they eventually understood, was not simply a signal, it was the center of a society. Around it, the women had structured time, divided labor, maintained ritual, raised a child. The signal was almost secondary. In Mauritius, the governor examined the situation and declared that because the purchase of these people had been illegal under French law, the transaction had never been legally valid. They had never, in the eyes of French law, been slaves. They were free people, and had been the entire time they were on that island. He adopted the grandmother, the mother, and the baby. The baby was named Jacques Moise, Moses, because he said he had been rescued from the water. The island was renamed Tromelin. Castellan du Vernet faced no criminal charges. He died in France in 1785, a free man. The copper bowls are in a museum in Paris now. They were found in 2006 by archaeologists who went to Tromelin with the specific goal of recovering evidence of the women's presence. They dug carefully, and what the sand had preserved, in almost 15 years of burial, was not tragedy. It was precision. Bowls with even rims, tools made to last, objects that reflected a decision made somewhere in the second or third year of abandonment that whatever was going to happen on this island was going to happen with intention. Jacques Moise would have been in his early 20s when Castellan died in France. Whether he ever knew that is not recorded anywhere.